This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you, Marcia. Well, it's really nice to be here, and this is the first opportunity I've been able to really talk with my colleagues here in the Horticulture Section and then SIPS wider about kind of some of the work that I've been most involved with over the past 10 plus years. So this presentation is titled Action Research and Reclaimed Places, Partnership Development for Community Horticulture Projects. And I'm really focusing today on how you can learn a little bit about the process, the participatory action research process as a potential tool for working in community-based horticulture projects. Some of the things that we're hoping to talk about again and have a little discussion about at the end of this presentation is really understanding the participatory action research process as a tool, again, for partnership development projects and grants. Demonstrating some examples and lessons learned from some of the action research projects I've worked in a community horticulture setting, and then really applying those tools and resources to New York State. So as Marcia mentioned, I've worked in nonprofit contexts for a national nonprofit called Earth Force, which basically did a community environmental action process with youth. And then I went on to work in farmers markets, as well as working with the city of Savannah. So I have this diverse background and have worked in many areas of the country, and I've applied basically the same process to project development in those different communities. So I've learned from different contexts and different settings how this works, how it can be improved, and I'd love to share some of that with you all today. And even though we normally in Cornell Garden-Based Learning really try to do a more interactive presentation style, I will be waiting until the end. So if you have questions, I will have some pauses during the presentation. So please feel free to put those into the chat and we'll address them definitely at the end of the presentation. All right, so this is the basic concept around learning by doing participatory action research. I actually first learned about this at Cornell over 10 years ago with the Cornell Urban Scholars Program, and PAR really draws on a wide range of influences among both professional training programs as well as those who draw on more of their life experience and public education. So many of the concepts I'm talking about draw on the work of Paulo Freire and adult education research, as well as the civil rights movement and key initiatives like the Participatory Research Network created in 1978 in New Delhi. So the basics of this, I really wanted to break it down a little bit. Essentially, each piece of this participatory action research process engages community in different ways. The participatory piece, first starting with that word, really we're talking about engaging in collaborative work with community partners, not necessarily bringing research to the community partners, but developing questions with community members. And so this is a more, as opposed to kind of more maybe traditional research methods, it's more about empowering and engaging communities in developing questions and addressing issues through their own solutions with those same community partners. The action element, of course, is where people actually create real change in their communities. And this is really where also we like to see real outcomes in terms of the interventions that are provided. And then the research piece is of course key. So when we're reflecting and learning about how this intervention went, we really want to know, how does this build on our past knowledge? How does it help the community take those next steps forward towards solving the issues in their community? I love this quote too. This is just a really helpful quote, I think, around sustainability in general, but this kind of education and research process. Sustainability is better seen as a measure of the relationship between the community as learners and their environments, rather than an externally designed goal to be achieved. And that's really key. So we're working on, again, developing that relationship with the environment, with the people in that same community, instead of providing solutions. So it can be certainly a messy process at some points, but it really works with how adults best learn. People learn through that active adaptation of their existing knowledge in response to their experiences with other people in their environment. And that is what social learning is all about. I really like this diagram because I think it really helps to show how community change using this process is really a long-term process, right? So it's not It's not a one and done kind of situation. Really, this process starts with a community inventory of issues and strengths, right? So, for example, if you're interested in food security issues in your community, the engaging with a real world setting situation might be actually doing a walkabout of your neighborhood, identifying locations that might be potential community garden locations, and really, again, focusing in on that issue of how you want to address it, in this case, with a community garden. The planning and action and intervention stage, that's really where you've taken this policy and practice research into an actual setting of clear goals and objectives and developing a detailed action plan. And then of course, next step is implementing the strategies and developing and actually taking action in the community with a diversity of partners. And then evaluating and reflecting on the results of the community groups involved and sharing that back with the community. So how has this benefited, for instance, food access in a community in the case of a community garden? And then of course, as you see, again, this is a process that you can do multiple times on a number of issues. So if you're talking of, again, this community gardening and food security issue, you might address 1 year, establishing a community garden, potentially finding another issue related to this that you wanted to build on, and you would take this process again in developing more community solutions to the issue at hand. I want to just touch on briefly this participatory action research process within the context of high quality adult learning methods. So this is definitely something that we preach a bit in our Cornell garden-based learning programs, but it's so important. Most of my life, most of the work I've done in community-based settings, in government, in environmental education has all been with adult learners, whether they be K through 12 educators or neighborhood association leaders. So with that context in mind, we really need to think about educating for the public in a very different way. And so much like working with young people, there's a real focus on, again, experiential learning. And for adult learners, that can be building on their life experience. So you really want to, again, touch on the experts in communities, right? They're experts in their own lived experience, and really touch on that with the kinds of projects you develop and engage them in. You need whatever project that you're developing to be relevant and impactful to the learners' lives. So again, we're most interested as adults in developing something that's going to actually positively influence our neighborhood, our community, and our lives. And then the problem-centered piece of this project-based learning is really all about, again, addressing an issue, right, that comes from the learners, the adult learners themselves, and having it be, again, impactful to their lives. And of course, being involved in that process is really key. So in participatory action research, we're involving adults in developing the questions and addressing any issues with solutions that they are really helping to generate. So to make all this possible, we really need to have some key things in place, right? We need to understand adult learners' motivations and goals. We need a safe and trusting learning environment. And we know that adults are going to know about 85% of the information we come up with or you're planning to share. So remembering that and understanding that what you see today, for instance, you'll probably only remember about 30%, right? You'll remember about 50% of a demonstration and 70% of what you simulate, and then 90% of what you actually do. So that's where really participatory action research and action projects in communities are so powerful. They assist the learning process for adults, and then we're actually doing something that we can then retain the information a lot better. So I'm going to tell just a few stories of how I learned about this process and why it's been so powerful in my work, working in community-based environmental education and sustainability work. So I first started, again, learning about this process through the Cornell Urban Scholars Program, which originally, when I took the course, again, it was a summer program, an 8-week program in New York City. Ken Reardon led that initiative throughout the year before and trained us in the process. And then we were paired with a partner. And in my case, it was Roger Hart at the City University of New York, who works in children's environment research. And that was the area of research I was involved with in my graduate work. So I really loved applying this methodology to this children's environments and specifically children's gardening spaces. And in the case of, again, the context of New York City, The gardens that I researched and worked in were in the Lower East Side. Many of them had been developed when the city was, in that part of the city particularly, had long-term disinvestment. There was a large movement of guerrilla gardeners. Really, the Project Green Thumb originated in New York City with some of these thriving gardens in vacant lots in the Lower East Side. And again, now there's this pressure for development in this part of the city and throughout the city for many of the gardening spaces. So one of the reasons I was paired up with this particular researcher was to kind of, again, defend the need for spaces like these for natural children's spaces in the city. There's a lot of research and benefits for nearby nature for young people, from both concentration and mental health to just a physical activity and cooperation of children and learning social skills. So I actually conducted kind of a behavioral analysis of students and, more young people and families in these garden spaces in comparison to some of the more traditional playgrounds. And so that research, again, was kind of my introduction to participatory action research, but it really, in the context of everything else that I've learned since then, it really has helped to spur a lot of the research and interest areas that I've had going forward. And one question I'd just love for you all to reflect on and think about is, what are some of the other community health benefits of gardens in the face of climate change and this pandemic? I think there's a lot of things that we could potentially research in community garden spaces in the future that we haven't tapped into as much. I'm now going to jump forward a little further along to an example in Savannah, Georgia, just a few years ago. So I worked in Savannah, Georgia in the Sustainability Office, and as a neighborhood services coordinator, I went to a lot of nightly meetings and engaged a lot of people about what they most wanted to see in their neighborhoods. And a big common theme throughout lots of our neighborhood meetings was the need for community garden spaces that could be sustained. Again, having resources and funding available, as well as really sustainable volunteers. And so this became a big part of my job. Not only helping community gardens get the resources and partners to make them more sustainable, but also engaging in kind of this process of understanding what makes a sustainable vacant lot into a gardening space. And so I did a number of things to assess that with community partners and neighborhood members. I became involved in the Savannah Urban Garden Alliance and engaged a number of environmental partners in the community to do a green infrastructure professional development for like many of these various community partner organizations to kind of get us all on the same page around what are the needs for green infrastructure in this coastal flood-prone community. We did a vacant lot nursery study and really assessed what could we use these lots for, even alternatively beyond just community gardening spaces. And so we really looked at how could we potentially use them to raise trees that could be used in city planning efforts. And then finally, we worked with a youth group to do a pilot tree planting project with a community partner, Savannah Tree Foundation. So this was really the whole assessing the needs stage. Again, that kind of observing what's happening, engaging community partners and organizations, did a lot of surveying of, I would say, I think 12 neighborhood associations about what they really wanted to see. And that really laid the foundation again for developing this partnership network that would help to create a new grant program through the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network grant, all focused on, again, flood-prone communities that are very impacted by climate change. And in the case of Savannah, when I was there, they had 2 hurricanes that didn't do as much damage to buildings, but did some terrible damage to their pretty famous tree canopy. So trees and flooding was very much on the top of mind for many people in this community. And basically, as a result of this, what we came up with in this Green Infrastructure Initiative grant was a grant to fund sustainable landscaping and arborist training, because many community members, we had to actually hire outside of the city to get arborists to come and support city tree planting and maintenance efforts. We also were replacing, like I mentioned, trees following 2 hurricanes. And we're looking for a more productive use of vacant FEMA lots, which cost the city thousands of dollars to just mow every year. And then we also were trying to add small community supported green spaces. So some of the trees that were in the nursery were intended to stay in these lots as long-term pocket parks in these communities. So in the end, we ended up with these partners, and I've kind of put these similar stages here to kind of help you understand some of the different stages of that PAR process with the partners in play. So we really observed, again, using mapping technology, using GIS, NOAA Sea Grant data, and UGA helped a lot with this, and really evaluated where were the plots, the FEMA lots that were basically flood prone, could never be built on, and where were they also overlapping with areas that had a high unemployment and basically a low income community in Savannah. So we found 3 specific community garden sites where we already had some relationships developed through the Community Garden Alliance. And we partnered with Victory Gardens, again, to assess how much would it cost to really put in some long-term sustainable vacant lot tree nurseries in these nearby plots. So just, again, as another use for these lots. So we evaluated, like I mentioned, these vulnerabilities and assets in the communities. And after doing that pilot study, we really convened the partners. And now, since then, they've been implementing these 3 small-scale nurseries in green spaces. And they're really successful and have had a lot of really positive interactions with other community partners beyond this as a result. And so some of the community events that they've been able to do to reflect on this process have involved sharing results and evaluation factors back to the funders about the success of this program. So I'd love to just take a moment. I know that I've talked a lot so far. I would love any comments or reflections on what I've shared so far about how you gather community partners around a common research mission or objective, and really what projects we're already doing in horticulture that might be able to be better supported maybe by this kind of methodology and neighborhood-based resilience in New York State. So I see a lot of potential in this area, not just in urban areas, but also rural and suburban. So I'd love any thoughts that you have on those 2 questions, and really just wanted to give folks a minute or 2 to think about that, and then I'll carry on. This is a picture of some of the students implementing that pilot project I talked about. Looks like somebody raised their hand. I think if folks want to put their comments and thoughts into the chat, actually, I think what we'll do is just, we'll have a little discussion at the end. I think that's the way we've kind of been asked to run this. So we'll definitely get to any questions you have at the end. I'm going to share one additional example of participatory action research. And this is in the context, again, of working with youth in Southeast Michigan. So this is a fantastic organization called the Southeast Michigan Stewardship Coalition. That's mission is completely based around place-based education with young people in the Metro Detroit area. But essentially, most of the work with this partner was also educating other adults, again, educating other educators on a process for kind of breaking the paradigm of education and having students engage with community members in addressing issues with community-based problem solving.
And Ashley, I'll just alert you that you do have a question in the chat.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'll answer it. Looks like the question is there any effort towards promoting food trees? Oh, very good question. Chestnut trees are a really good source of nuts and need to be planted more anyways. Just wondering what types of trees are being raised in the nursery. That's a great question. And this is, again, we'll get to a more of a solution to that question. We actually did look at that, and it ended up not being a great fit, again, for the city's needs. They're looking more for street trees, not as much food growing trees, even though several of the community gardens in Savannah actually grew peach trees and kumquat trees and other things like that. But these were more kind of the adjacent community garden lots. So we did do some of the fruit tree planting and some of that, again, with more of the lots that were affiliated with the community gardens, but with some of these more tree nursery lots, that wasn't really the focus. It was, again, more looking at street trees. So I can pull up, I've got to pull up the report to get the list of trees that we were recommending. And again, they've had a number of iterations of this since. So I need to do a little follow-up with the folks there and find out exactly what trees they've chosen. But they had to be flood prone. Well, actually, they had to be trees that could be okay with having like wet roots, which many of the trees in Savannah are. But again, they had to kind of serve a couple of purposes. Does that answer your question? And we can talk a little bit more about that too. And again, I really am excited about sharing these with you all because, again, I come from a social science background, and I've done some research and done a lot more research and learned a lot more about trees and the urban landscape. But I'm really excited about working with partners who can bring that kind of level of expertise to this kind of work. And this is something we're developing for Cornell Garden-Based Learning as well. And again, when I talk a little bit more about this example with the Southeast Michigan Stewardship Coalition, the people that are organizing this, this organization are really the university professors that are getting in touch with the content experts and resource experts that can help the students and educators create action projects. So that's kind of the beauty of this, is that you don't have to be the expert in all of this. You just have to know how to build the partnerships and bring the experts to the table that can work with community partners. So in this case, I'm just going to give a little bit more of an example here. 1 year, they do a different theme for professional development every year, and this was all about climate resilience, so that's very, I think, topical to what we're all dealing with this year, and really worked with students and educators across Metro Detroit to look at Great Lakes integrated science and assessment data, and really some data from the City of Detroit Sustainability Office to understand, again, at neighborhood scales, how students could contribute to formal sustainability and climate resilience planning initiatives. So the students and their schools were obviously distributed throughout the City of Detroit as well. And we're involved in a community environmental inventory of Great Lakes climate impacts on Detroit, and then planning some resilience projects that could be, again, learning kind of labs for the students at those schools, as well as addressing some key issues in that community. So all year long, the Southeast Michigan Stewardship Coalition provides professional development to its educators in this network on this topic. And so it preps them to work with the students using this data, and then really engages them with the community partner approach. So after looking at the data in Detroit, students would then be paired up with an EcoWorks AmeriCorps member, part of this organization that really develops resilience projects in Detroit, and worked on stormwater management, tree plantings, and household response plans for things like heat waves. So they developed action projects that really addressed some of the key issues in lower income neighborhoods in Detroit. And as a result of that, they then worked with Michigan Sea Grant partners, again, working with that university connection to get funds and work with reflecting back to the NOAA Environmental Literacy Grant Program, the data and results of this grant. So it was kind of similar in some ways to the way we work at Cornell Garden-Based Learning, in that we are working on developing professional development for our educators, which in our case happens to be community horticulture educators. And then we ask for evaluation to help us that feedback loop of how are we doing? Are we addressing the real needs in your community? Are we creating things that you need to do this work? And so the final piece of this program that I love is the Semis Community Forum. They bring all the students and teachers together to Eastern Michigan University for basically a community showcase of their projects. So they get to share back not only with other educators, but with their peers about what they've done and how it was successful. And then they build on that year to year with new topics through the coalition. It's a really great model, and I just love some of the resulting projects. So I am gonna kind of pause there, and I'm thinking now we're gonna transition to our second objective, which was to look into the community mapping tools that can be helpful for you developing some of these projects in your own communities. Or maybe in your own research. I'm just going to double check the chat. It looks like we have one other question. Folks working in Ithaca saying it's a little bit difficult to balance volunteering with local communities and being a student in search of a career. How do you engage people in local communities, and what types of groups people do you target? This is a great question for this section particularly, because it can be incredibly messy and challenging to work in community work. It's definitely, I just want to acknowledge that this isn't simple, it's complex. And so it really takes doing an assessment first and working with building that trust over a couple of years. And in both of those cases that I've talked about, those community organizations have deep roots in that community. And while I was a facilitator of writing grants and bringing people together, the partnerships that had a strong connection and a sense of community in themselves were what made them successful. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and why it's so important. But these are kind of some of the tools for assessing both your vulnerabilities related to where you most want to work on these kinds of community horticulture projects, as well as what kinds of organizations do you want to engage and build trust in to do this work with you. Because as somebody at a university, or a local government, it takes a lot of energy and effort to really build that trust with local organizations. And so, like I said, it takes time. And as a student, it can be difficult for sure, but working with those right partners will give you that foot in the door to be able to work really effectively on these kinds of projects. So in the case of Savannah, I'm going to use this as an example of using these tools. We use the Social Vulnerability Index through the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. Again, remembering that we had a sustainability plan, we had a real focus effort on figuring out some key areas to work in the city. And so we were able to look at, with this tool, a mapping tool, where are there flood-prone communities that also overlap with low-income, communities. And there's a lot of these areas in Savannah because it's a low-lying coastal city affected by sea level rise. So we were looking not just at that, we're looking more at like where are the flood-prone neighborhoods that also happen to have a lot of these FEMA lots, obviously, that we could potentially do more of this job training piece. And so that tool was really helpful for really focusing in on 3 specific communities that had strong neighborhood associations, strong connections, already had this great neighborhood cohesion, and had a lot of buy-in to this kind of work. And that's where, again, the assets come in. So the asset-based community development, getting back to that question, is an incredibly powerful tool that has been utilized in Savannah for a very long time. And I learned this when I got there. I learned about this tool. It's through DePaul University, but it's a very, very good community-based development kind of tool to look at when you're thinking about what community partners are in a community already, which ones kind of best align with our mission or our research objective for some particular project or program. And then it also has even some interview tools for finding individual strengths. So again, as you'll look at this diagram, you'll see there's local institutions, associations, and individuals. So I'm going to go in a little bit more depth about what this looks like. I just put up Tompkins County here for reference using that same Climate Explorer tool. Again, this is a tool that I didn't add the key here, but the very dark blue areas are areas that are both flood prone, so have that as a potential climate impact in that community, as well as have some social vulnerability factors also layered into that map. So as you can see, the dark blue areas are the areas that are most impacted by both. And this is just an example of a way that you could help to prioritize what community, what part of the community might we be doing projects in that would help us to address multiple issues at once. Other tools I would also suggest using for other kind of goal areas like food security and ecosystem services. iTree has some amazing capabilities for telling where there's a lot of tree canopy versus not a lot of tree canopy in relationship to income levels in those neighborhoods. And there's also a USDA food access atlas that can tell you where there's access to grocery stores and that kind of a thing. So if you're looking at those other factors, you might want to look at different mapping tools for assessing this. And then getting back to the assets, I think listing really for gardening purposes, for horticulture purposes, What are the individuals, associations, institutions, and physical spaces available in your community to address one of those pre-existing vulnerabilities that we talked about? And so that's the way we formulated some of these grant programs around kind of these two areas, assets and vulnerabilities. And then just to kind of wrap it up, I wanted to share a few of the common project partnerships that we've, again, when I say we, I'm talking about the City of Savannah Sustainability Office and my work with a national nonprofit. There was, very much a community engagement process that looked at what kinds of partners should we be engaging effectively. And these are the common ones with the organizations I mentioned. NOAA and Sea Grant has an amazing amount of resources specifically related to resilience. And Cornell has a fantastic program in that regard as well. Local government sustainability and planning offices are often really, really partnership focused and very community-based focused in their responses. Community gardening organizations, obviously. I've had a lot of success working with them in the past in projects because they have a real ability to unite people from across a whole region in this kind of work. But then when you actually get to the action part, not only are you working with the neighborhood level, neighborhood associations, governments, agencies that work in this area, you might need some additional kind of hands-on action project partners. So these are folks like garden education organizations, tree planting organizations, and watershed organizations. In my experience have been kind of the top three for this kind of work. And we've had a lot of success, again, in engaging them in this kind of project. And then, of course, working with the University Extension or local public schools, that added element of how do we evaluate and share the results of these projects long-term? Did they work? Did they not work? This is where Extension can really play a really key role. So lessons learned. I wanted just to share a few key takeaways that I really think we can then apply to our local context, to our statewide context in New York State. What I've found in a lot of the best partnership arrangements, we've had a lot of really wonderful, diverse partners with different strengths and skills. Like I mentioned earlier, you can't possibly have all this knowledge and background to effectively create a community-based project. We really rely on content experts, but also on community experts. So from their own lived experience, people who are going to be benefiting from these kinds of projects need to have a vested interest from the get-go. And problems always arise, right? So in the case of some of these projects, we had a number of hurricanes, we had budget cuts. There's a lot of things that come up. So it's really important, again, to think about from a sustainability standpoint, the three-legged stool. So having multiple funding streams for economic sustainability, having in-kind and support of organizations that are aligned with your mission. For instance, the City of Savannah providing free access to these FEMA lots was a huge asset that we took advantage of. And then, of course, building on the community momentum and interests. And so I think, again, there was a lot of activism around planting trees at this time when I was engaged in Savannah, and specifically for neighborhoods that were surrounded by industrial uses. They really wanted to see more tree plantings. They wanted to see better air quality, flood control. So everybody, it was a win-win for a lot of people. And that's kind of the last takeaway, is that when developing these kinds of community-based action projects, I've really found that finding elements that support a number of the stakeholders, their strengths, but also what they have a stake in, their interests, really is key. So in the case of the Savannah project, we had job training, we had a reduction in the city budget, we had replacement trees from the hurricane, we have a green space for communities that really wanted them. So there was a lot of partners that benefited all at once. So I'm going to take a little pause again. I'm trying to slow down, but not too much. I want to have some conversation at the end. I'm going to transition into the third part, which is just how does this apply to community horticulture projects, specifically in the context of Cornell Garden-Based Learning, working with our Cornell Cooperative Extension offices. So I'm just going to focus on briefly two programs that are ones that's already been developed and has a really great track record called Seed to Supper, which is our essentially our curriculum, a beginner's guide to low-cost vegetable gardening, but it's really about partnership and community building. And then a new program called the Food Forest Trial Garden Program, which is a little bit more on the, I guess, community food forest kind of side that we talked about a little bit earlier. So just to reiterate again, Seed to Supper is a really, again, complex community-based program that involves a lot of steps. Essentially, we provide a curriculum and a six-course series that we help to get educators prepared for statewide. But we really are providing, again, kind of a community-based model for this. So it's very unique in every county that we run this program. It first starts with getting a satellite partner, which is our Cornell Cooperative Extension offices. And they host essentially this program. Often we'll apply for our mini grants. They then work with us to advertise to community participants and also getting garden educators, which are our volunteers. Many of them happen to be master gardeners. And we put them through kind of a garden education preparation every winter. And sometimes when we have a student course, which we do this year, we engage Cornell students in actually preparing the educators across the state. And then finally, those same garden educators work with host agencies like neighborhood associations, like current community gardening associations, food pantries, many different partners that already work in the food security arena to implement the program. So it's a great model for, again, how we can kind of build these partnerships. And there's an evaluation of our Seed to Supper participants before and after the course to see how that's really helped to shape their gardening experience and their ability to grow food. So there's a wonderful kind of, again, model already set up here in New York State for this kind of work. And there's a new program that I'm working on developing with a number of community partners and statewide partners called the Food Forest Trial Garden, which I'm hoping to build on the success of Seed to Supper sites, really adding an element of climate adaptation education and food security education to that program. So we're hoping through this program, again, to develop a series of advanced Master Gardener volunteer training topics on ecological gardening. And so this is a neat area we found through a lot of surveying and a lot of work with partners. We have a community horticulture work group through our Sustainable Landscapes program work team. We're developing kind of this network of experts on this particular topic or across the state. And we just had our first meeting and have been reviewing our Cornell Garden-Based Learning Library course, which is our Master Gardener training, to see where are the gaps. What are some potential new areas we could be educating people on? And like I said, we've done a number of these surveys with partners across the state and looked at that feedback we've gotten. And here's some of the next steps that came out of that. We have a couple of advanced topic courses that we want to add again to our core training based on the feedback that we've gotten. Water management, again, rain gardens and xeriscaping are a big area that master gardeners want to learn more about. Soil health and depth and climate change and plant selection are huge areas that got a lot of votes from all our participants in the course, as well as integrated pest management, specifically biocontrol. And then of course the design principles behind how to really apply these skills in specifically a food forest trial garden, which is a demonstration garden. And master gardeners across the state understand this, and this is really a concept that many Cornell Cooperative Extension offices, even here in Tompkins, they have a great demonstration garden area where you can learn about a lot of different gardening techniques. So this is building on kind of advanced, whereas we have our Seed to Supper, which is beginning gardening, this is taking it to a next level with more advanced training for these master gardener volunteers. And as a result, we're hoping to have a plant selection list that can be implemented in a second and third year. So the final piece is here. In year 2, in 2022, we'll host a demonstration site installation, again, getting that experiential learning for our educators across the state. We'll provide in year 3 a mini grant program that will take the resources developed and the plant selection list and share those with our educators statewide in Cornell Cooperative Extension offices so that they can implement their own small scale demonstration site. And my hope is also that we can add to the research and evaluation elements here in the horticulture section, like the woody plants database. We're hoping that maybe there's some very successful plants in these gardens that we could add to that database as well. So finally, we're kind of wrapping up here. I would love just to leave some extra time for folks to ask questions. But the Food Forest Trail Garden Partners, as we kind of talked about at the beginning, the partners helping out in this initial first year phase of assessing are the Sustainable Landscapes PWT and some new student hires with landscape architecture and horticulture background. We're working with key counties that have experts in this area, CCE Tompkins and Schuyler and Tioga and Steuben. We're hoping to then plan and engage them along with Master Gardener volunteers in an implementation workshop of a food forest trail garden site. And like I said, evaluate the education and learning that happens as a result of this that can then feed back to the horticulture section. And these are just a few of the really fantastic partners that we're interviewing and talking to about future workshops. But we have some really wonderful people working in the state. I get to work with all of these wonderful folks, and I'm really hopeful that we can get some input from all of you all. So I believe I'm at time, and I would love to open up for question and answer and hear what you have to think about participatory action research as a method for this kind of research in community horticulture. All right, I think I'll open it up. Anybody has?
Hi, Ashley.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this awesome talk. It reflects really well. I'm taking this climate change and human development class right now in DSOC. And so I noticed that you're speaking, especially in all of these community-based projects, it's within the critical discourse surrounding climate change, where a lot of like government agencies I've noticed, and businesses especially, they operate more in the biophysical discourse, where it's more about, okay, this is the problem that's happening to our climate, this is the solution that we're going to use, and it more focuses on economic gain. So I was wondering within that, how you see kind of moving forward with these programs, and how, because you have worked with government organizations, especially on the local level. So how do you see transitioning that into more community involvement and kind of bringing that more into the mainstream in the future?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because honestly, working with local governments, exactly, you're completely right. I think what's really challenging about it is that it's mostly about the bottom line. And I think for a lot of local governments, again, they'll do a carbon assessment. They'll really they'll see where their largest, potential carbon, issues, and they'll really focus in on that, more on a technological piece. But from a perspective of, again, resiliency, all of that, the literature and the best practices really look at how do we engage people in developing some of these resiliency skill sets. And so I think that action research and this kind of work, again, it has to be integrated into planning. So as you saw in the examples in Savannah, we had a sustainability planning effort that preceded this, right? So there was a large effort to survey and engage community neighborhood associations to find out what do they find most important, what do they most want to do. And that influenced and informed the plan. And we had the right political backing at that time to do that. And again, they had all of this prep work and this asset-based community development work that all of the neighborhood associations apparently went through an extensive training on this method to develop neighborhood associations, over 40 in the city. It was a huge effort. And they have a ton of very, again, a very tight-knit community-based network of organizations that work with neighborhood groups throughout the city. So it's it was a very unusual city to work in that way, because I think it had this groundwork for that kind of, and they actually had a ton of positions at the time for neighborhood, basically neighborhood outreach folks. So I think that's one way that we could better do this, is that in bigger cities, again, really having dedicated people like the role I had, where I would be going out and going to neighborhood meetings and engaging directly with neighborhood leaders. And we need that kind of hands-on building of trust in order to, I think, again, translate what's happening more at a city government level with trying to reduce carbon impact to how does this really relate back to my life? Like, how does this relate back to how it will impact me? And I think that's where the public health folks are really helping out a lot with that, with a lot of these mapping tools and kind of practices at educating community members about the impacts of climate change on a very local level. And the way I was able to work with some pretty, I would say, regressive sorts of policies around things like green infrastructure was to really just talk about flooding. We don't even talk about climate change. We just talked about flooding, and we talked about how it impacted people's lives in a very real way. And that really got a lot of community buy-in, which then added to that kind of political pressure. Plus, getting money doesn't hurt. If you get money from grants to do this kind of work, it really helps. I hope that answers a little bit of your
It does. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anybody else who has any other questions? Because I know there's a lot of great experts, and I tried to, again, put a lot of information in, but wanted to have more of a discussion again about how this relates to your own work, or again, for students, their interests. If this is something that folks want to learn more about. And again, partnering with other disciplines like urban planning, like landscape architecture, I think there's a lot of potential to really be integrating both the plant sciences and the social sciences. So thank you.
I have a question for you, Ashley. Can you hear me? This is Anna.
Yeah.
In trying to do and sort of involve people in participatory action research, have you found that it takes a while sometimes for volunteers to understand the principles of doing this? And I'm sorry if I missed this in your discussion.
Oh, no. And honestly, I think one of the challenging things about doing a seminar like this is because it's, normally when we do a workshop in Seed to Supper, we really first ask questions about the audience and kind of get a sense of where people are coming from. And so that would be that's really, again, where the volunteers, and again, in many of the communities where I was working in Savannah, there was not necessarily a huge environmental bent, but really more of, again, a social justice bent to a lot of the neighborhood organizations, their leanings. So I really found that to get people on board with this, I didn't talk about participatory action research. I really just talked about, here's some key areas that we're hoping to look at citywide to influence health and sustainability. And we talked about these 5 key areas, and one of them happened to be more green infrastructure, though we might have used a less jargony term at the time. And so really describing to people why this would be beneficial. People get community gardens pretty quickly because it's we'll have food. And it's this is something people want. They want more community spaces, and they want more, accessible food, healthy food. So those were not as hard of a, I think the buy-in wasn't as hard as, again, kind of describing why we needed more trees in the city and why they're so beneficial. And that there's different cultural feelings about trees in different areas related to safety, related to all kinds of things that you might not normally think of. So I think once people got, and again, I have some really great kind of article I can share that talks about some of the impacts on some of the local community members who then got trained in the full kind of arborist training program. And I think they really show how the benefits of this community project speaks to the community. Again, when it was all about job training and helping people to start their own businesses, there was an incredible amount of buy-in from these communities that were looking for jobs, looking for opportunities. So this is something that there really wasn't a lot more of in that part of the state, or really, there really were no organizations doing that kind of work already. Unlike here, I think we're not green infrastructure projects going on. So it was new, and it was providing economic opportunity. And so that was, I think, the biggest, most positive way that we were able to also then generate some, from a volunteer perspective, also getting a lot of volunteers engaged in, from the communities to reach out and get people involved in the training program. That was huge. Any other questions? Well, I appreciate everybody coming out today. And if you have any other questions, feel free. I can put my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out. for more information.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.